Thank you. Good afternoon, Reverend Father and ladies and gentlemen. I think the reason that I'm actually here and have been asked to speak was because of a case that I wrote up and had published in the British Medical Journal late last year. And I'll just tell you the story of this young girl. She was approaching matriculation in New South Wales, which is a phenomenon that starts at the beginning of Year 12, which is in the September of the year before. So she was coming up to that, and she had noticed that for some period of time, almost 2 years, her periods had become irregular and scant, and then they'd stopped. And then she'd developed hot flushes and no more periods sort of at all after that. And she'd been to see her GP in a nearby town and been prescribed the pill, but she was a fairly intelligent young woman, and she thought, well, that's all very well, but I'd like to know why my periods have stopped. So she came to see me in an adjacent town, and I think possibly because I'm sort of known for not prescribing the pill, so I think she thought she might get a fair hearing. And she presented her symptoms to me, and I organised some blood tests, saw her again in a couple of weeks' time. But she asked the question at that initial presentation. She said, look, could it be Gardasil? Because that's when things seem to unravel in this department for me. And I said, look, I don't think so. I've not heard of such things. But let's find out what's going on, and, we'll discuss it next time I see you. And by the time she came back in a couple of weeks, we had confirmation of premature ovarian failure. We had what we call a raised FSH, which won't mean much unless you're a doctor, but basically she had biochemical evidence of premature ovarian failure, plus the anti-Müllerian hormone, which is a test we'd also organised in the meantime, which is a measure of ovarian reserve. So when you have a lot of women who are in their mid-30s who are deciding whether to have their children now or put it off for a couple of years, they'll ask for an anti-malarial hormone test because that gives them an idea of the measure of their ovarian reserve. And the magic number's 14. So on this girl, to try and sort out whether this was just a blip in her reproductive life or whether this was the end of the road for her ovaries, we organised an anti-malarial hormone test, and it came back unrecordable. So there was no evidence that she had any egg activity in her ovaries as far as we could measure. So that was the story of this lady. She asked the question again, obviously, after this diagnosis had to be put to her, and we got a second opinion from a specialist in the city nearby. She asked the question again, could it be Gardasil? And I didn't feel quite so confident to say, no, I don't think so, because I really didn't know. And so that's when I started the research on this, which is the beginning of 2011, so I could answer her question, basically. So what I'm going to present today is really the story of that trail. By the way, when the British Medical Journal published the article originally, they published my initial report on the research that was available. So the first thing that I had done after this girl was confirmed menopausal at 16 was to notify the Therapeutic Goods Administration and to ask them if they had any other cases. And I also, because I used to have rats when I was a kid, I kind of said, well, what did the rat studies show? And no, that was confidential. They couldn't tell me. I had to file a Freedom of Information report. And so I did. And then while I was away with a bunch of kids at World Youth Day, they sent me a little text asking for a few $1,000s to process my Freedom of Information report, which I didn't. And I applied under public interest. And so what came back was that there was no histology report on a rat ovary ever presented before the licensing or after the licensing of this drug. No histology report, which means they hadn't actually looked at the rat ovary after vaccination under a microscope and said, yes, the eggs look normal, yes, the tissue in between looks normal, yes, it's a healthy looking ovary. They'd never done that. The rats were killed after 1 litre. This is the whole reproductive study in animals before it was introduced to our girls. The rats were killed after 1 litre, so we don't know how many more they might have been capable of having, how many pups in each litre, or at what age they might have gone through menopause themselves. So there was not much mammalian research out there. Now, there are various vaccine principles that I'm going to go through today. Also, we do need to understand the worth of the vaccine. So we do need to have some facility for knowing what Gardasil can and cannot do. And then we'll go through the safety studies that have been done, the conflict of interest that emerges, the Therapeutic Goods Administration's role, India, and then look at some teen pregnancy rates. Now, basically, all vaccines represent a special category because vaccines are given to healthy people for diseases they might never contact or come across, and they're given mass into the population. So vaccines are a special category. They're not like drugs you give someone who's sick. The emphasis is therefore on safety. And the Food and Drug Administration in America says there is a low tolerance for significant adverse events associated with vaccines, that is, caused by vaccines, or low tolerance. So as physicians, we have really three responsibilities. The first one is the well-being of the individual. Our task is to make sure that we have the information available to make sure that it's not contraindicated in a girl or a boy who's to be vaccinated, to make sure they're well enough to receive it, to make sure it'll be for their betterment and not their detriment. We also have to enable, as physicians, we have to enable informed consent. And the Australian vaccination guidelines state that this can only be given after the relevant vaccines and their potential risks and benefits have been explained to the individual. That's in the handbook. And we also have to promote individual decisions. The Australian government immunisation provider, speaking of Gardasil for girls over 18, says the decision to vaccinate needs to be an individual one, taking into consideration the likelihood of past and future exposure. So Gardasil is a vaccine that was brought out to immunise us against the human papillomavirus. It's known as HPV, and it's a double-stranded DNA virus. There are about 140, they think, different types. There's the high-risk ones that can cause cancer if they persist, and there's the low-risk ones which just cause genital warts and don't cause cancer. Now, this is a bit of technical stuff, but I'm just going to have to shoot through it because that's what it's about. It's about informed consent. It's about knowing the arguments. HPV has a 50% transmission rate. So if you have sex with someone who's got it, you've probably got a 50-50 chance of catching it yourself. Most of those infections will clear in 1 to 2 years because we have our immune systems to take care of it. But 3 to 10% don't, they persist. Those are the ones that may cause cell changes on the cervix, that may go on to cause cancer later, a decade or so down the track. And the low-risk ones, type 6 and 11, will cause 90% of genital warts. Types 16 and 18 will cause 70% of cervical cancer. So there is an issue. Those are the references. I'll scoot through those, but if you want them, I'll give them to you later. Okay, so Gardasil has those 4 strains in it that we just talked about. The 2 that are effective against genital warts, 90%, and the 2 that are effective against cervical cancer, 70%. But before we had Gardasil, we had and still have got pap smear programs, which already prevent 70% of cervical cancer. And in the decade prior to 2005, and I chose that time because that's about when we were thinking of introducing Gardasil, in the decade before that, the incidence of cancer of the cervix had dropped by about 57%. So the pap smear screening program is highly effective if people access it, if they use it. The death rate from cervical cancer in Australia is the second lowest in the world at 1.7 per 100,000, and our incidence of cancer of the cervix is also the second lowest in the world. Since that figure was put out, and again I chose that because that's when Gardasil was introduced, we think it's now about 1.4 per 100,000 Australian women who die each year from cancer of the cervix. Most of those deaths are in remote and Indigenous communities where there's poor pap smear access. And that same phenomenon applies in the developing world. Most of the cancer of the cervix in the world is actually in the developing world for the same reasons, as access to pap smears. Now, just to go back just briefly, HPV is found in most of the cancer of the cervix, so it's found in 99.7%. However, It's not the only cause. It's a necessary, though not sufficient, cause for development of cancer of the cervix. We do know that smoking plays a role, that the pill plays a role, and we think heredity plays a role. As we all know, it was developed in Australia, and it's not effective against all the other cancer-producing viruses, strains of HPV. So although it knocks off 2, it won't prevent all the other ones that can cause cancer, and there's quite a few of them out there, about 15 other strains that will and can cause cancer, and different studies give different numbers. It's given as a 3-dose course at sort of ground zero, 2 months, and then 6 months after that, so there's 3 doses. It's meant to be a vaccine that contains no actual viral DNA. It's made up of virus-like particles which mimic the viral capsid, the shell, if you like, of the virus. So pap smear programs are going to have to continue, even with Gardasil, side by side, right through our lives. So it won't prevent needing to have pap smears. They are talking about bringing out a 15-valent vaccine which will cover most of the cancer-causing strains, and that could lead to the demise of the pap smear program and the skill of our pathologists in actually doing pap smears as well. It's being talked about, it's not here yet. The effects of pap smears and Gardasil, though, are additive. So when we say that Gardasil can take care of 70% of cancer of the cervix by preventing the viruses, it's the same number as pap smears, but the two kind of will be additive, will be cumulative. So yes, it's effective. You don't need to go into all the signs, but it's effective not in the studies that can show it's effective against cancer yet, because cancer takes too long to develop and the studies haven't been around long enough. So yes, it's effective against the precursors of cancer. And there's references for that. So when they found, and here we go, when they found that it was effective against the precursors, it was fast-tracked. So Gardasil became a vaccine that was released before it had reached the endpoints of safety and clinical trials. It was released after a 6-month approval process, which means it had to go through like 6 months of paperwork and presentation of evidence. And it didn't actually meet the criteria for fast tracking. Fast tracking is meant to be a process that avoids the red tape for drugs that might be a relief against cancer or in epidemics or some urgent need that arises in the community where you can't really wait for a long process of adjudication on whether it should be out there. So it has to be a drug that has superior effectiveness to existing treatments. It doesn't have that. It's not actually a treatment either, it's a prevention. It has to otherwise improve the diagnosis or prognosis of a serious disease. That it may do in part, yes. Or avoid the serious side effects of an available treatment. It doesn't quite measure up to that one. It had been found at the point of fast tracking, you don't need to know all of this, but it had been found at that point that although it was 97% effective against the cell changes which can go on to cancer, in the field or in the community, it only seemed to be effective against 40% in the population. And that's because a lot of women had multiple infections or a prior infection that wasn't covered in the vaccine. And it was also noticed that the vaccine could actually exacerbate, make worse, a pre-existing viral infection. And there's references for that. We do know that 1 in 3 fast-tracked agents are withdrawn from the market due to adverse effects. That's if they have a 6-month approval time, 1 in 3. Gardasil, as we know, had a 6-month approval time. Now, the Medical Journal of Australia, only a few weeks ago, wrote this: if circumstances do not permit a rigorous assessment of a vaccine's safety before licensing, this important caveat should be communicated to providers and consumers. Now, as a mother who had a child at school when this was coming out, the consent form that came home made no reference to the fact that this was a fast-tracked vaccine. I've never seen a consent form or any information in a handout from the government to parents which alerts them to the fact that this has been a fast-tracked vaccine. By September 2012, which is actually about the time that my article came out, 60% of all serious adverse reactions reported to the vaccine adverse event reporting system were from Gardasil. So that's compared with all other vaccines, 60%. And in fact, they had 3 times the adverse incident reports of all other vaccines put together. That's Gardasil. Now, reports only suggest patterns, they don't suggest causality, but in those reports, the neurological disorders did rank the highest frequency. The vaccine is most effective in girls before they become sexually active, so that's why some of the studies have studied down to age 9, and in America it's promoted from age 9. It's given in Australia from age 12. But if you're going to be giving every girl in Australia a vaccination, I think you need to be pretty sure that for pubescent girls, their fertility is protected. So my question is, and was in answering this girl, has reproductive health been assessed in safety studies of Gardasil? Now, the information to check this out is available from the trial data, the clinical trials before it was released, and then from 2006, from surveillance after, which means the marketplace has become a lot of the testing ground. Now, I'm just going to look at some of the major studies that have been done. The very first one was a study that was published to look at the effectiveness. It was phase 2 trial. Now, I don't need to really go into all that, but phase 2 studies look at the clinical effectiveness as well as the safety of a vaccine. Now, this phase 2 trial had written in it, when I read the details of it, and I've got a copy if you want to see it, participants in this trial were required to use effective contraception throughout the trial. It was a 3-year trial, small numbers of women, but they were required to use effective contraception. Now, in the medical parlance, effective contraception is not barrier methods, because as we heard from Andrew, they've got a high failure rate. It's not IUDs, because these are young girls, or this particular trial they weren't, but if you haven't had a baby, IUDs are considered to be not quite the best practice in medicine, be putting IUDs in women who haven't had babies. So we're left with hormonal contraception. So they were basically required to use hormonal contraception throughout the trial, effective contraception. That invalidated this study for reproductive health assessment. If you're on the pill, you will have a pill cycle dictated by the packet of pills. It's got nothing to do with your ovary. It overrides the ovary. So that study was invalidated for reproductive health assessment. It had no capacity to detect ovarian effects. Later studies, however, will quote this study as establishing the safety of the vaccine. The study was funded and sponsored and designed by Merck Sharp and Dohme. The second study to look at is a study of 20,000 women. That's one of the major studies quoted, looking at the effectiveness of it, but also making a comment on the safety and drawing conclusions on the safety. The women in this trial were asked to use effective contraception through the vaccination period. That invalidated the study for reproductive health safety assessment. They were followed up 6 and 12 months thereafter, but that was only for collection of blood to check if they had antibodies to what their antibody titers were, and also to check on pap smears and swabs. So the follow-up was designed to see how effective the vaccine was, not to see how safe it was. However, they did record serious adverse events. Now, serious adverse events have a certain definition. They're life-threatening events, death, disability, or something that requires surgery to sort of fix it. So serious adverse events are not tiddlywinks. They did ask about serious adverse events. But of course, cycle control, fertility, what are your periods doing, that doesn't come under a serious adverse event, even if they've stopped completely. The third study is interesting. I'm going to spend a little bit of time on that because our Murdoch Children's Research Institute was actually involved in this one. In this study, they actually looked at younger girls and younger boys of the age group 10 to 15, and they also looked at some older women, 16 to 23. The 16 to 23-year-olds were instructed to use effective contraception throughout the vaccine trial period, which was to the end of month 7. So for them, this study invalidated any initial assessment of reproductive health safety. But then they analysed, because they realised this was the first study that had ever been done on young kids. So they started looking a bit more closely at this sort of safety parameters. But in doing so, they decided to look at adverse events that had occurred at a rate of 1 in 100 or more. So they didn't look at the rarer ones. You had to reach a threshold at which they would start to look at, could this have been an adverse event? More than 1 in 25 vaccinated participants dropped out of the study early on. So that's a big departure rate from the study. And most people who do research will tell you that the ones you lose are often the ones that have got jack of you. They know they've signed the consent forms, something's gone wrong, they know they've got no redress and they're over it, they want out. So 1 in 25 were lost early on. A 15-year-old boy died suddenly without cause, nothing found on his post-mortem, 27 days after the second vaccination. No cause, they don't know what happened. One of the young girls had a vaginal hemorrhage 26 days after the second vaccination and again after the third vaccination. They got a couple of, I should add that before they took these boys and girls into the study, they were assessed for any health problems. So they only had really healthy kids in this study. But after this girl had a hemorrhage, they got a couple of gynecologists to comment and they said, well, maybe she had a pre-existing condition. What condition? It was never stated. Again, it wasn't actually designed as a safety study, but it is much quoted as showing the safety of this vaccine in young people. So because it was the only one available, or the first one at that time, they decided to check these kids again at 12 months. So 12 months after their first vaccination, those who were under 15, the plan was the study would get them back and see how they were going. And they looked at, by the way, just as they were doing the study, they looked at their temperatures and they watched them for the first half an hour, and they got them to fill out report cards if they had an adverse event within 2 weeks of the vaccination. And then they interviewed them at 2, 3 and 7 months. The older ones were still on the pill at that time, and the younger ones a lot of them were prepubescent. There were a few who were pubescent, and then there were some who would have been having regular periods. So that was the stage at which they then got them back for a final 12-month check of those young ones. But unfortunately, I'll just come back to that in a moment. Unfortunately, when they came back at 12 months, they weren't very assiduous in following them up because they lost more than half of them to follow up. So of the girls aged 10 to 15, 53% were lost to follow up. They were left with 240. The boys, they were left with 205. And we know that the under 15s had 15 and under, had 3 serious adverse events: death, one mental health problem, which led to an overdose, and this vaginal hemorrhage was actually quite life-threatening and it ended up putting the girl in hospital. So there's quite a high rate of serious adverse events, given that serious adverse events are potentially life-threatening. We don't know what the periods of those girls would have been like, but if we go a little bit further and do a little bit of maths, the adverse event report cards and things they filled out showed that the girls and the boys and the women all had a fairly consistent level of reporting of sick-making events, what we call systemic adverse events. They made them sick in some way, as opposed to an injection site reaction. So they're fairly high figures and fairly consistent in the 3 groups. Of the 240 girls who were left in the study at 12 months, who were aged 15 or under, you can only assume the researchers had spread the ages evenly across the age rungs leading up to that, in which case you've got about 80 girls who might have been expected to have had menarche, which is the beginning of menstruation, and regular periods, who we might possibly assess the vaccine safety on in terms of reproductive health. So of all the studies done, of all the thousands of women, we're left with a very small subset to try and gauge what is the effect of this virus on reproductive health. And in one of those 80, as we know, we had a vaginal hemorrhage. We don't know why that happened, whether it was ovarian, some hormonal disturbance, we don't know. But that's one of our very few windows on what is Gardasil doing to reproductive health. I'll just go back a couple of slides because I was just going to mention that in this trial, the investigators themselves assigned what adverse events were likely to be due to the vaccine. And it was based on the established safety profile of the vaccine. But this vaccine was new. It didn't have an established safety profile. It didn't even have rat studies on fertility. So how could they possibly be assigning causality on the basis without evidence-based medicine? I do not know. Then there's the massive Future 2 study. Now, a lot of these studies are arms or protocols of the Future 2 study. It was a huge study. And the Future 2 study at least gave 916 girls a report card to fill out. And they were aged older. They were aged, most of them were aged 15 to 26. But again, the report card is very interesting because it prompted them. It had prompts on it. So all the prompts were concerned with injection site reactions. Did you feel dizzy after the vaccine? Did you faint? Were you, sick on the tummy? Were you a bit nauseous? So they were prompted to fill out certain things. And then there were some open-ended questions. So it's no surprise that at the end of the individual arms of that study, they reported that most girls had acknowledged or said or recorded that they ticked those boxes, that they had, yes, the things they were prompted to reply to. They had a sore arm or a red arm or they felt dizzy or whatever. So they weren't open-ended questions, they were prompted to respond in a certain way, which then skewed the figures that came out. In the major Future 2 study arms, at months 1, 6, 24, 36 and 48, after vaccination, after the third vaccination, the girls were reviewed again for specimen collection, so for blood and for pap smears and swabs and that kind of thing. And they did, after the vaccine period was finished at 7 months, they did record serious adverse events, the ones I've defined before, those serious life-threatening disability, might need surgery, death, those things. They weren't interested in other adverse events that occurred after month 7. And they identified no safety concerns, even though the Future 2 study had no capacity to identify ovarian harm, subfertility or infertility. The Future 2 study was designed and managed and analysed by Merck with external academic investigators brought into it. In all of the arms of the Future 2 study, women of reproductive age were advised to use or requested or required to use effective contraception. So they were all on the pill up to the end of month 7. Now this is one of the most important sentences, I think, that I came across. New medical conditions were not considered adverse events if they occurred after month 7. So by the time the girls who were required, requested, instructed, asked to use hormone contraception came off them and then got back to their normal cycles, no new medical conditions were going to be recorded. So pre-licensing studies, the major Future 2 study protocols, were invalidated for assessment of reproductive safety. So we're left with studies after licensing. In 2010, Merck Sharp and Dohme, studying their own drug, summarised the data that was to hand. And they looked at the 107 serious systemic adverse events that had been recorded in vaccine trials at a rate of around 1 in 100, sometimes 1 in 200, but commonly 1 in 100. And the investigator, that's the Merck Sharp and Dohme investigator, decided that only 5 of 107 were vaccine-related. They discounted all cardiac events, 4/5 of neurological events, all mental health events, various other categories. There was also placebo confusion because the placebos that had been used in trials before licensing, that they were reviewing and getting all the studies pulled together into this data, had used mostly an aluminium placebo, aluminium hydroxysulfate something, and it was identical to the aluminium in the vaccine. So it wasn't like a normal saline placebo, it wasn't like a normal control. In the one study where they did use, one of the arms of that study, one of the protocols where they, in the future study where they had used saline as a control, the adverse event rate was 9 to 1. So 9 adverse events from Gardasil to 1 from the placebo, and they didn't know whether they were having the placebo or the vaccine, of course. Why do they put aluminium in the vaccine? Because it enhances the antibody response. So it has a reason to be there, but I don't know why it's used in the control. Now, the Canada Communicable Diseases report that came out last year said it is important to reiterate that decisions relating to adverse events or relating adverse events to vaccination, in that particular study and in others, were based on the judgment of the investigator at the study site reporting the event. So it's a call the investigator makes, not necessarily evidence-based. Looking at past safety profiles and looking at other studies that are equally flawed, going back to the beginning, where again, as I said, we have no rat studies. So we have a system in place now where we're relying on the public to report adverse events. We're relying on health professionals, nurses, teachers, parents, and young women and kids themselves to somehow or other know that they need to report an adverse event. And again, the consent form doesn't mention that. It's a passive reporting system. Basically, I was looking for my time up there. Basically, the VAERS system, the vaccine safety surveillance system based on adverse event reporting, uses the number of adverse events reported and divides that by the denominator, which is the number of doses that leave the factory. So it's a ratio. Now, where I work in the country town, we often have blackouts, we have floods in Bellingham and all sorts of stuff, and our vaccine fridge periodically next morning will tell us that there's been a break in the cold chain. So we toss out all the vaccines, the whole lot get tossed out. That would happen probably a couple of times a year. So the number of vaccines administered is nowhere near the same as the number of vaccines that leave the factory. Also, if the packaging is damaged, you turf it out. If it's reached its shelf use-by date, you turf it out. So when you use as a denominator the number of doses that leave the factory, you're going to get a very skewed idea of the adverse event reporting rate. Plus they use individual doses, but each kid gets 3. So what if there's a cumulative effect from vaccines? Now, the Centre for Disease Control in USA and in Canada and the Food and Drug Authority acknowledge these weaknesses in the passive adverse event surveillance system. And so they employ another thing called the vaccine data link, because in America everyone's sort of got a number and the number gets plugged into the system. And I don't know how their confidentiality works, but they can trace people through the system by this number. And so they chose to look at adverse events after vaccine and see if there was a pattern, but they only focused on 9 diseases. And you can guess, none of those 9 were to do with reproductive safety, ovarian function, infertility, subfertility. There were other categories, which is fair enough, but could they not have put a 10th category in there? Now, there have been cases of premature menopause notified in America and in the UK and in Ireland. The thing about premature menopause in 16-year-olds is we don't know how common it should be because it is so rare. You don't see 16-year-olds with it hardly ever. Now, the young girl that I wrote up for the British Medical Journal, we checked her for any other causes that were identifiable, and a lot of times you don't find the cause of it, but she had no identifiable causes like chromosome problems or galactosemia, all those things. And because it's such a rarity at that age, the only published figures on it are for women who go through menopause like from 29 or under. We don't know the true incidence in 16-year-olds, so we've got no figure to compare the vaccine incidence of premature menopause with in the natural state, because it's so rare. Now, we talked a minute ago about what if it's cumulative, and there is a thing that neurologists have been noticing. I don't want to spend too long because my track is reproductive health, but the St Vincent's Hospital in Sydney, Ian Sutton published a study in the journal Multiple Sclerosis, which looked at 5 patients who presented to St Vincent's with new onset multiple sclerosis after Gardasil. The thing that was odd about them is they each had an atypical form of multiple sclerosis. It had come on fairly quickly. It wasn't the usual type that teenagers can get. There were atypical features about it. So he wrote it up. And all of them, of course, would have missed the 14-day report card, for Gardasil, which is not designed to pick up long-term things. And they called for more research. So St Vincent's Hospital Neurology Department, peer-reviewed journal, called for more research into Gardasil. At the same time, the University of Heidelberg published some similar cases, one in particular, and they are also calling for more vigilance on Gardasil and complete phase 4 studies. Phase 4 studies is when you look at big cohorts in the community and you watch them for years. Now, the study that's always thrown at us and thrown at me, I have to say, is the massive one that was published the day after mine came out, which was 189,000 girls who were looked at for reactions after they had been given the Gardasil long after it was licensed. And only 23% in the whole study, by the way, received 3 doses. But how did they assess it? Well, they said they were going to look for, I'll just go back a slide. The primary aim was to evaluate the safety of Gardasil, HP4 is Gardasil, during the course of routine clinical care. So to analyse the safety during the course of routine clinical care, they decided to see how many girls had turned up in accident and emergency after they had their vaccinations, how many had been hospitalised, and that was it. So they tried to establish whether there were hospitalisations and accident and emergency presentations which could tell you whether the vaccine was safe or not. Now, I've also worked in accident and emergency since 1982, except for my maternity leaves, and as well as doing obstetrics as a GP. I've never gone into a cubicle and said, what can I do for you today? And had the girl say to me, my periods have got scant and irregular. Those girls don't go to accident and emergency. And if you certainly don't put them in hospital. So they're going to fly under the radar of this 189,000 Kaiser study, which proved which tried to say, and I'll come to that in a minute, that Gardasil was safe. But this study had no capacity to assess reproductive safety signals. So the Kaiser study looked at events on day 0, day 1 to 14 and day 1 to 60 that might have landed you in hospital. But it did more than that. It then compared girls and boys who ended up in hospital after their school vaccination or whatever with how they were 6 months down the track. And if they were still crook or still sick or still had a problem, a health problem, the conclusion was, well, then it wasn't Gardasil because you're still sick, so it can't have been the Gardasil. So that they formed their own control group by looking at their health a few months down the track. The Kaiser safety group then pre-prepared summaries of all the kids who'd presented to hospital and been hospitalised or sent home from accident and emergency, and pre-prepared analyses, and then gave those Kaiser vetted results and Merck, Sharp and Dohme vetted results to independent investigators. Even despite all that, they found 21 diagnostic categories which had significantly elevated odds ratio. So in other words, things occurred more frequently than you'd find in the community. And there were some central nervous system, circulatory, heart, asthma, musculoskeletal, lymph nodes up, some personality disorders, infections and diabetes that were showing up as being possibly something that needed more research. They didn't count flare-ups. So if someone had a pre-existing condition and it got worse after the Gardasil, that wasn't counted, which creates problems for us then as GPs to know, well, is there a group that's for whom Gardasil is contraindicated, apart from allergies? Is there another group we shouldn't be giving this to? So this Kaiser study, prepared at great expense and looking at massive numbers of 189,000 girls, was unable to detect rare conditions, those that didn't require emergency care, prolonged illness, or long-term safety outcomes. It was sponsored and funded by Merck Sharp and Dohme, who provided substantial input to study design, analytic plan, reviewed the data and helped draft the manuscript. Half the researchers of the study declared a conflict of interest, including owning shares in Merck Sharp and Dohme. Thank you. India. India is interesting. In 2010, they halted the Gardasil program. They'd had it, had a taste of it, they called it off. There were reasons given. One, their feminists, their women's rights activists said, hey, there's no informed consent going on here. This doesn't meet the elements of informed consent. We're worried about this vaccine. They brought it to the attention of the government. Their scientists were also concerned. They said a scrutiny of the trials of Gardasil and of ethical and regulatory documents highlights problems in the implementation of this schedule. They also pointed out the science they weren't happy with. The trials conducted for regulatory requirements may be insufficient from a scientific point of view, and they cited lack of transparency in the clinical research. And they drew attention to a breach. They started throwing the Helsinki Declaration back at us and the International Convention on Medical Research Guidelines, and said that this vaccine needs phase 4 studies. And these studies are done in an entire population or a subgroup to detect the rarer or unexpected events that may not be seen in smaller phase 2-3 studies that we looked at earlier. Post-licensing studies of large populations in a more heterogeneous group of people over longer periods of time are necessary to provide ongoing assessment of vaccine safety and effectiveness. That's India. They called it off. Now, Bill Gates and Melinda Gates have been in there trying to reactivate the program there, and I recently heard that they've slashed the price of it, not by them, it has been slashed to try and interest India in this vaccine again. The Therapeutic Goods Administration spokesperson has said that the TGA investigates, to me when I inquired, serious adverse events. So when they had several notifications apart from mine of young girls who had stopped menstruating after Gardasil, they had never investigated them because they weren't serious adverse events. Now, the Medical Journal of Australia last year published a study by Sydney University into the Therapeutic Goods Administration with a very damning assessment of them. And they said that they weren't rigorous, anywhere near rigorous enough in following up safety reports, and there was a complete lack of transparency on the part of the TGA, which was consistent with them being the subject of several recent reviews and inquiries. The TGA reassured, it actually wasn't State Parliament, I'm sorry, it was the Senate, this year, that there were no reproductive effects from Gardasil. There were no signals, and that it was a safe vaccine. I then emailed them and said, can you tell me which study had the capacity to evaluate that? And an email came back just a few days ago saying pre-licensing and post-licensing studies. Now, I think that's about equivalent to a Year 8, social studies project. I don't think that's a very scientific response from our regulating authority. Vaccination of males. So why do we have it? The reasons given are basically that it's effective against genital warts, so we should be also offering it to our boys. And it's effective against a persisting type of HPV that I mentioned that can go on to cancer, because in homosexuals, this virus, if it persists, can also cause cancer of the throat or pharyngeal cancers and things. So they wanted it to be available to prevent that morbidity and mortality in men. And they said it was safe. And they wanted to increase herd immunity, because if girls are not getting the vaccine at a rate of 70 to 80%, the herd immunity drops, and then it becomes like sort of exponentially less effective. So they wanted to increase the herd immunity. And the National Prescribing Service said that men who have sex with men, homosexuals, receive little benefit from the HPV vaccination of women and have a higher risk of HPV infection and HPV-related head and neck cancers, and that the vaccine given to all boys will affect the direct protection and herd immunity. And those are references for that. So just out of interest, I looked at the teen pregnancy rates, and in the United States, the teen birth rates in 2010 were the lowest ever recorded across all ethnic and racial groups. And that was a report by the National Centre for Health Statistics in 2012, based on the 2011 figures. In the United States, they credit this with strong pregnancy prevention measures, and they say that contraception may have contributed because they have all the data on how many scripts are written for the pill and all the rest of it. So their own reporting body was that conclusion was that contraception may have contributed. In South Australia, which in Australia keeps the best figures on this sort of stuff, they said that they found that the teen birth rate had also dropped, and it was the lowest teen pregnancy rate ever in 2010. And the 2-year drop it had been coming down before that, and so had America's, to be fair, had been coming down, but it suddenly went down more steeply. And in South Australia, the same thing. The teen birth rate had been slowly coming down. But then from 2008 to 2010, after Gardasil was implemented, was the biggest 2-year decline they'd ever seen, to give them the lowest teen pregnancy rate on record. Now, they looked at all their figures for abortion drugs, things to solve, the pill, all the rest of it. They keep track of their terminations in South Australia. And in the South Australian Parliament, when these figures came out, they gave the credit to pregnancy prevention through SHINE. So that was not attributed to contraception or to abortion. They attributed it to abstinence advice and self-respect advice that came from the group SHINE. So basically, Gardasil requires urgent, systematic, controlled trials, especially given that ovarian function was masked in all the safety trials. There are no rat studies ever done to evaluate ongoing ovarian function after vaccination. There's no histology report available on a vaccinated rat ovary, but we do have it on the rat testis. A very good histology report on the rat testis, but not available on the female ovary. And safety trials were invalidated for reproductive health by the methods chosen in the study. Yes, it's effective against 70% of HPV cancer-causing strains, but at what cost? And that's the end of my talk.